This is Dan Schneider, and this is the third of my trilogy on the idea of free will. I have Timothy O'Connor of Indiana University. He is a philosopher and Christian, and he will be speaking about the idea of free will with a religious perspective, and the conversation will begin in a moment. My guest is Timothy O'Connor. He is a philosopher. He is at the University of Indiana, a Hoosier, and we'll be talking about the idea of free will from a religious and I guess a Christian perspective most cogently. So Timothy, I'd like to give people who I interview a few minutes to introduce themselves on however they want to. So if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and anything you've written and what drew you to the ideas of free will.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan, on your show. As you say, I teach at Indiana University. I've been here 25 years now. Grew up in the Chicago area. Wrote a PhD dissertation in philosophy on free will under the direction of Carl Genet, a philosopher who's written extensively on that topic. I was drawn to the topic of free will because it's a very puzzling topic, because on the one hand, it seems the most obvious, natural thing about us. It seems to us introspectively as we go about our lives, most of us, that we have some measure of control. We make choices, and it's up to us how to make those choices, within the range of our experience and knowledge and so on. But on the other hand, when you try to theorize about the nature of free will, it can be a very puzzling topic. It can look like you have to choose between thinking of free will as sheer randomness, uncaused behavior having no explanation, or you tack to the other extreme and you think of all behavior as determined in a kind of machine-like clockwork fashion, the way we think much of the natural world operates, right, according to laws of motion that are more or less exceptionless. So free will is supposed to be something in between those two. It's a puzzling thing. It gripped me my first undergraduate course in philosophy. I worried briefly that the very idea of free will might not be a coherent idea. And so I was drawn back to that topic when it came time to do a dissertation much later as a graduate student. That culminated my thinking about free will in a book called Persons and Causes, The Metaphysics of Free Will. But of course, as always happens to philosophers, you put your ideas out there to scholars, and you get a lot of criticism, and so then you begin to rethink some of the details. So I've been writing a string of articles ever since. But free will, of course, it's not just a topic of interest in its own right. It's a question about what it is to be a human being, right? And what is the place of people in a impersonal reality, right? Impersonal biosphere and ultimately cosmos. So I find this one of the most gripping philosophical challenges, to make sense out of the idea of conscious, self-aware, subjective, and to some degree autonomous human beings within this vast cosmos that operate in accordance with very different principles altogether. Then many philosophers share that kind of project with me. But then those of us who are also religious philosophers, or specifically theists, that adds a new wrinkle, right? Because theists believe that underlying the impersonal cosmos is an ultimate personal reality, that is the foundation of everything. And this underlying reality is thought to have some really extraordinary attributes, being omnipotent, sovereign over the whole thing, knowing all things. And this poses a new set of challenges to human free will. Because if the world is ultimately controlled by personal reality in some fashion, then in what sense could there be any wiggle room for something that's not yet already set in the cards, right? If we have free will, does that mean that that's some kind of limit on God's power or perhaps knowledge of reality? So there's a whole theological aspect to this question as well, and I think about that topic too.
Well, a lot of people sometimes email me and think that I pre-plan a lot of these shows, and oftentimes I've had some guests who come out and they have ideas that or beliefs that I didn't know of, and I don't actively research. I mean, I'll look up, for example, people who've written books on a certain topic. And you said just before we started the show that you're a Christian. Now, when you say you're a Christian, does the denomination of Christianity matter in terms of free will? Because I was raised a Lutheran. Are you a Methodist or a Presbyterian or what?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, but I'm a little bit of a theological mutt. I would say I'm
Okay.
a creedal Christian. I endorse the ecumenical creeds of the church. So, the specifics. So I'm a Protestant Christian. I'm not Catholic or Orthodox. And yes, certainly some of the denominational traditions have a either more strong or less strongly favorable view of free will, famously. So within the Catholic tradition, you tend to have robust support for the idea of human free will, thinking that's part of how God has gifted human beings, made in his image. In the Orthodox tradition, you also have a pretty emphatic endorsement of the idea of human free will. And of course, this is connected to the idea that human beings bear deep responsibility for their choices within Christian theology. With the Reformation, the reformers were not so positive on free will. Luther famously, and so you say you grew up a Lutheran background. Luther was again it. Calvin, I think, was a little more subtle of a thinker on this point, but I think he also did not put much stock in the idea of human freedom. So within the Protestant tradition, you often do have skepticism about the idea of free will, but that skepticism then poses a theological challenge. Well, if human beings don't have free will, then God is ultimately responsible for everything, including the most horrific aspects of reality. And that's a bit of a problem. So those who embrace free will see that as a fatal problem for free will skeptics.
Let me just take off from that, because I mean the obvious thing that's always brought up then is that if humans have free will, true free will, then God cannot know what any individual human or any sentient being, let's say there are aliens out there and God created them too, knows. And then if we say, well, if God is truly all-knowing, as most Christians would believe, he has to know everything at every moment in every corner of the cosmos that's ever been or ever will be. And therefore, life and existence becomes sort of a Punch and Judy show. And you have to wonder, why would God create a Punch and Judy show just for his own entertainment? He must be a really dull guy.
Sure. Yeah. So, first of all, we would say, we have to be careful about saying what it is to know all things. God knows everything there is to be known, if Christian theology is true. Then the question is whether facts about future human free choices that haven't been made yet are out there to be known. If they're not out there to be known, then it's no default in God's knowledge, no fault, no weakness in God's knowledge that he doesn't know those truths. Right. So one way that Christian philosophers have thought about this question is to say the future, there are no facts about the future, only perhaps probabilities. God knows all the probabilities. He sees branching space of possibilities, maybe even weighted possibilities. Some are more likely than others. God would know that too. Right. So he kind of sees all these branching possibilities, but he doesn't know which of them is going to be actualized because he's given human beings free will. That's one perspective, but that perspective kind of invites you to think of God as in time, looking towards the future in the way we might try to do when we make predictions. A more common view within Christian theology, and for that matter, Jewish and Muslim theology, basically generically theistic perspective on God, is to say that God is outside of time altogether. And so Aquinas and others use the image of God as like someone up on a mountaintop who sees a winding road, right? And he sees all the points along the road, right? If he's outside of time and he encompasses all of time, so he sees events as they happen, timelessly. All of past, present, and future is immediately grasped by God. And then the thought is, it's not that because God knows it, he forces these events to occur. He only knows them as they occur, right? And so that's no more of a threat to free will than if you watch me speaking right now and know what I'm saying as I speak, right? You wouldn't take that to be a reason for saying that I'm not speaking freely, right? Because your knowing it is consequent upon my doing it, right? I do it, and that as a result of that, you know it. And so you might think that's how it goes with respect to God and knowledge.
I know you're not a Hindu or an Eastern religious philosopher, but I've heard the arguments about God being in time or without time. But I know a lot of the Eastern, especially the Hindu, I forget which of their gods, Vishnu or whatnot, the one that has the eternal dream. It would seem to me that their idea of what they consider the maker or the God, and again, I apologize to any Hindus out there if I'm screwing it up, but their ultimate God, in a sense, is time, in that God, as their ultimate being, is actually the creation of events as time moves along, rather than being outside or being inside time. That God seems to be something like time. And if I were to be religiously inclined myself, that seems to me a bit more, I don't know, likely. Do you have any truck with that, or am I misinterpreting? If you know if I'm misinterpreting an Eastern view.
Yeah, so it sounds, although I'm not certain about the particular view you're referring to, it sounds to me like you're in the neighborhood of what philosophers call a pantheistic instead of a classical monotheistic conception of God. On the pantheistic conception of God, God is in some sense all of reality, considered in terms of its most fundamental eternal attributes. So God is not a distinct entity from the stuff of reality. We can talk about that. That's a radically different conception of God. That's not a God, a personal God with whom one can interact. And so it certainly is not consistent with the monotheistic conceptions. But then there's a more in-between view that is sometimes called a panentheistic view, on which the world is in some, God is distinct from the world, but the world is in some sense like God's body.
Yeah,
right.
I was just going to bring that up, in fact, because I was thinking that rather than that God is not, when you talk about personal God, we think of God as a being. That view presents God as everything, more than a being, than an everything. And how could one have a personal relationship with that kind of a God? And is that the kind of God do you have that panentheistic view, or is it more of a personal, that God is a person or a persona?
Yeah, no, it is that God is a personal reality. It's a little bit complicated in Christian theology because we believe God's a tri-personal reality. But yes, God is a personal being, right? Who intended to and freely and back to free will, God's own freedom. God freely created the cosmos and everything therein, and God intended. He did so intentionally with to carry out purposes known only to Him, perhaps fully, at least certainly fully. And He's a being that can, and Christians believe does, interact with human beings, reveals Himself. We believe through the Christian Bible, and supremely through the person of Jesus of Nazareth, whom Orthodox Christians believe to be God incarnate. So yes, that's the way I think about God. So I think about God that way because I'm informed by the Christian tradition. But I also think about God that way. I also find philosophically it to be a preferable way to think about God, because I think the most compelling sort of argument for the existence of any kind of divine reality has to do with trying to account for the structure of the world. The world seems contingent. It doesn't seem in and of itself a necessary reality. It seems like things could have been otherwise. Laws of nature could have been different. You and me, we could have failed to exist. It could have been different in lots of ways, it seems. And then to account for why the world is the way it is, there's different kinds of moves one could make, one of which is to say this world is the product of a supremely personal being that exists of absolute necessity and saw purposes in bringing about this world.
Well, let me get focused down now on free will, because we talked about the religious aspects. Let me just talk about free will. And modern science often looks at something like the fact that light can be either a particle or a wave, and it can sometimes go through the slit, and that somehow that decoheres the cosmos into two separate cosmos, and that every choice that we make decoheres the universe, so that within a matter of 10 seconds or so, we'd have an infinite number of cosmoses, even if we just started out with one. I always find that to be silly, and most astronomers and cosmologists even acknowledge that that's only a potential thing under certain circumstances or whatnot. But getting to the actual concept of free will, I always find it so ridiculous and reductive that people always think so binarily. You get to the famous Frost poem, I stopped in a wood at two, as a road split into two. But that person who has the choice of the two roads doesn't have to just go left and right. He could just stand there and dance a jig. He could think about something that happened. There are literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of things that could happen there. So it's not a binary choice when we're talking free will. There is a multiplicity of choices. Why do we, when we think about free will, always think in such a binary way, do you think?
Well, I mean, you may have to ask the individual human being
Well,
why
you as a human being, do you think
yeah.
binarily?
No, I don't. If you're saying, do I think binarily in terms of we only ever make choices between A or B? No, of course not. Sometimes we confront situations that call for creativity, and we kick around a range of possible ways of acting. And as you say, even if I choose between one or two or three or four basic options, there's different ways in which I can carry out those options. Right? So I might have a choice. Do I want to lie because it's self-serving, or do I want to tell the truth and risk certain negative consequences for myself? Well, that might be a binary choice that I face, but there's different ways I could do that, right? There's different ways I could lie, or I could soft pedal the truth, and I could even tell the truth, but sort of withhold some aspects of the truth, right? So even there, when I see myself as confronting a basic choice, I see variations on certain basic themes. The other thing, though, when you talk about binary, I think so. I think you're aware a number of the sciences that deal with human beings, the social sciences, even neuroscience, social psychology, cognitive psychology, are now beginning to peer under the hood, you might say, of human beings and try to get a scientific handle on what's going on in our brains and in our conscious minds when we make choices. And some of these folks claim we've got good evidence that we don't have free will. They say, things are going on under the hood that the conscious person's not even aware of, and she thinks she's making a choice, but actually it's all being determined down below. Well, I have, we could talk about what kinds of evidence they give. But I think when you look at the kinds of evidence they give, they often can give you a binary choice. They say, okay, ordinary people have this idea of free will. Free will is, I decided. That's it. End of story. No causes, no sort of antecedent factors that influence me, just magic. Boom, I did it. And so, of course, they don't have a very difficult time of showing that actually human beings are influenced, sometimes unconsciously, by all sorts of factors, right? But why think that threatens free will? Why does free will have to be all or nothing in terms of, I'm an utterly free agent, totally uninfluenced by my surroundings, my upbringing, my genetics, and I'm completely determined by all those things, right? Maybe these factors shape me to varying degrees, but they make it more likely that I do certain things rather than other things. But I still make choices.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. I was going to bring up the topic of the idea of limited free will, which seems to me I mean, obviously, I can't do everything that I'd like to do, either because of physical limits or because of ethical limits or because of my age or my whatever. And you mentioned these people who are sort of against free will, and the classic test that I've seen numbers of times on PBS shows or documentaries online is, someone will be hooked up to a machine and they'll try to have to click a button, this button, left or right, when they notice something or whatnot, and people say, oh, it happened, 0.003 seconds before you could the speed of light or something, so therefore it had to be. Well, it's like, number one, we don't fully understand the processes, and the machines that they're using are just binary choices, which is like, again, to say something that, I'm going to pick left or right, black or white, 0 or 1, has nothing to do with whether or not I'm here saying, am I going to go visit my mother-in-law who cursed me out the last time because I went to a ball game with the boys instead of staying home with my wife to watch the latest rom-com or something. I mean, it's a total disconnect from the reality there. What is your take on these sort of what I would consider metaphysical / pseudoscientific attempts to get at free will?
Yeah. So well, first of all, you got to start somewhere when you're doing science, and neuroscience is, if not in its infancy, it's in its adolescence, you might say, right? It's only really gotten going since the 1950s, and so the brain's a complicated thing, and in order to sort of get a nice experimental setup, you got to make a lot of simplifying. You got to impose simplifying constraints. So I have no problem with designing these simple experiments where wiggle your finger, you decide when, and then we'll monitor, see if there's some kind of ramping up brain activity going on before you are consciously aware of deciding to do it. That's all well and good, but then to draw these really strong conclusions. So Benjamin Libet was the scientist who pioneered the studies you're talking about. He concluded, he was apparently quite shocked and thought, oh my goodness, we have no free will, right? Because why? Well, because we have evidence that there's a certain kind of generalized brain activity that kind of ramps up a little bit before the time that the people report is when they were consciously aware of spontaneously deciding to wiggle their finger or what have you. Well, you could criticize that, as you said, on a lot of grounds. First of all, move my finger or not is not an interesting choice, right? Do I really know exactly? Can I pinpoint introspectively? Because we're talking fractions of a second difference here. Can I pinpoint introspectively the precise instant that I, felt the inclination or decided to move my finger? Well, probably not. In fact, there's good experimental evidence that we're not very good at precisely pinpointing the actual time that certain conscious experiences go on. You can influence our perception of, just like you can influence people's perception of when an event in their environment happened, you can influence their introspective perception of when something happened in their conscious awareness by conscious stimuli that you give them before or after the event. So there's all kinds of ways to criticize this, but people just doing the science, trying to begin to get a handle on what's going on, what parts of the brain are being activated when human beings experience themselves as making choices. That's fine. I like science, and I spend a lot of time looking at the science that has to do with human agency and choice and deliberation. Because I have philosophical interest in this topic, and I expect it's going to get a lot better. But I don't think we have any reason to suppose it's going to suddenly show us that, in fact, all our behavior is sort of being driven entirely by factors we're unaware of, and we're completely determined and we don't have choice. We have no reason to think that's what it's going to show. What it will show us, probably, is that there's a lot of complicated factors at play. When human beings do things, not all of which we're aware of. And
it reminds me of when I've read people talk about what the human mind is or what the brain is, and they'll say, well, the human mind is an illusion, and they'll go on to say, well, we get so much information. Daniel Dennett's idea, and yet people who are against free will, who are not necessarily religious, I always wonder, what do they think is the force then that is guiding us as basically then zombies or automata? And they seem to reject the idea of a synergistic complexity to things. Same thing with the mind. Is the mind, to me, is not the illusion, but the mind is how the brain takes in information and collates it and processes it, and that gives us the mind. That's not an illusion. That's the definition of what it is. And in the same way, it would seem that if we say, well, there is no free will, and we've got all these Libet-like tests that show that we don't have free will, okay, then what is animating us if not a God? That would seem to me to lead people back to the idea that there must be some animating force, and what else could it be but a God?
Yeah. So when people say things like the conscious mind is an illusion or free will is an illusion, they might mean different things. But if they really mean the strong claim, there really isn't any such thing as immediate conscious awareness. There's just the illusion, right? Well, then we have to ask, well, who is it that's subject to the illusion, right? There's a kind of self-referential problem there with articulating this idea of I'm deceived in thinking that I'm a consciously aware being. Similarly, if you try to say, like Daniel Wegner, famous social psychologist who died a couple of years ago, wrote a really great book called The Illusion of Conscious Will. Even though I completely disagree with his conclusions, it's a very entertaining read, and he gives you a good handle on the types of studies that lead people to say, some people, to say that free will is an illusion. But when Wegner wants to say, we are never, it's just never true. When you do anything as simple like right now, I think I'm deciding to pick up my cup in order to illustrate a point to you, right? Wegner says that's an illusion, that your conscious sort of intention to make a simple point about free will is what led this behavior to happen. What led that behavior to happen was actually subpersonal, kind of purely mechanistic neural processes that have nothing to do with your awareness. But if that's right, think about the nature of science, right? Why do they think this? They think, well, science shows it, right? A bunch of interesting scientific studies. Well, what are the sciences but organized activities of human beings who purposely engage in certain behavior, communicate those results to one another, correct their results, modify theories, very complex social enterprise, right? And if it's really true that it's an illusion, that nobody is effectively, consciously controlling their behavior, well, then why should we take seriously the outputs of science, right? Yeah. We take it seriously because we think we know what science is. It is precisely the kind of activity I've described. If it's not that, if it's just a bunch of behavior going on of kind of robotic-like individuals who have this deep illusion that they know what they're doing and why, well, then we would have no good reason to take seriously the results of the sciences. So once again, it's a kind of self-defeating kind of perspective. If you turn the view back onto the practice of science itself, right, it ends up undercutting. It saws off the branch on which the scientist sits.
And does that not also lead us to an infinite regress? Because if you're picking up your cup to illustrate a point, to me, goes back to, say, your need as a child to be right about something, which goes back to the way your mother raised you, which goes back to the way her mother raised her, which goes back to your Uncle Seamus 15 generations ago who picked up a fly swatter and swatted a fly, which goes back to, it gets to a point of, to me, ultimately silliness, does it not?
Yeah, so you're kind of going back to a kind of older, kind of Freudian way of saying it's all an illusion. There are these drives, at least there are on the Freudian picture, there are desires and beliefs that are explaining your behavior. It's just not the ones you think, all right, that are explaining your behavior. But right there too, I think you're spreading out and saying, wait a minute. So if we take this picture seriously, the whole human enterprise is a whole complicated bunch of things going on. How do we ever break in and become aware that this is really what's happening. I mean, notice what the Freudian psychologist is doing there. He or she, sitting above the fray of all these poor, hapless people who don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. But does that psychologist think of him or herself as being aware of why she's, looking at other human beings in the way that she is, and understanding what she's doing when she, embraces her theories, modifies her theories, and so forth? If she's adopting this perspective, I know what's going on. I'm unmasking what's going on, right? But she's sort of keeping herself out of the picture, right? If she were being completely consistent, she would say, I'm a masked human being. Well, then why do I believe Freudian theory, right? When it comes to some kind of generalized Freudian, crude Freudian conception of human activity, right? I don't know why I do, right? Because I'm not aware of what's driving me to do what I do. Well, then should I put any stock in it if I don't know why I believe it?
Yeah, and it comes back. It comes back.
A stateful view.
Yeah, it comes back to me to, again, this Punch and Judy show. At least if you have a God or a creator, even if it's some alien child and we're just little protista in his little cup or whatnot that he's playing with, that creator at least has a reason. Yes, we can go infinitely back. Why is that creator doing anything in some larger metaverse or something? But it would seem to me that if we have this Punch and Judy show and we don't believe there's any creator, well, that seems an even more illogical, and I mean, how would that get constructed? It seems to me that I'm not a believer in a creator or whatnot, but of the two choices, if I have this grandly constructed Punch and Judy show and we're nothing but a bunch of automata or zombies, well, it would seem to me that at least we're entertaining a God or something, if there is a God, whereas if there's no one to be entertained or nothing to be learned, what is the purpose of it all?
Yeah, well, presumably the person endorsing this view is going to say there is no purpose to it all. Yeah. But it is a really bizarre conception, and I think most important, there's no good evidence for it.
Yeah.
People claim that there is evidence. I know you've had on your show as part of this trilogy, Al Mealy, and he wrote a wonderful book, Effective Intentions, that explores all of this sort of science, the neuroscience, and some studies in social psychology. And I think he very carefully but very clearly dissects this and just shows that there's a lot of confusion. Just because someone's a scientist doesn't mean that they always reason well or draw conclusions well from their research. The scientific studies might be without flaw. The studies might indicate something. They generate some data. That's fine. And it's not for me as a philosopher to systematically critique the way a scientist goes about her business. But when the scientist draws these grandiose conclusions from a very limited body of data, then I think we can criticize it. And very often the arguments are very weak.
I don't know all of your expertise, but I wanted to ask a question regarding artificial intelligence. And assuming that, say, within the next century or so, that we get legitimate artificial intelligence, and whether we house them in bodies, sex bots, or whatever comes next, obviously there's the question of whether they have free will, whether we grant them personhood, when we still don't grant personhood to intelligent animals, much less some other human beings on our planet. I'm wondering what, number one, your take on artificial intelligence is and how it relates to free will, and do you look at human beings in a sense as sort of the golem that God created?
Yeah, artificial intelligence is a difficult and challenging topic to think about for a philosopher of mind. Because on the one hand, obviously, our most sophisticated computational devices, artificially constructed devices, have become very sophisticated, and they can engage in a kind of learning behavior, right? They can become trained to get better at certain kinds of tasks. And we all know about Deep Blue, computer is chess playing sort of computer. But the thing I would say, the first thing is for the systems that we now have, right? We have no reason to think these systems are in any sense self-aware, right? So I think foundational to being a person is to be aware of oneself as a self, right? For there to have a subjective point of view on reality, right? To see oneself as located within a reality, and to have goals, often consciously grasped goals and engage in behavior to attempt to achieve those goals. So that requires a certain amount of intelligence. Okay, I don't think so. As far as we know, any of the sophisticated forms of AI that we have now don't involve these kinds of personal attributes. So I don't think there's anything it's like to be Deep Blue, right? Or any other such artificially constructed device. And then you say, well, what does it take to get that quality of having a point of view? Well, that's a deep question, right? As far as we know, you have to have neural machinery more or less of the sort that we have or some higher animals have, right, to have that kind of subjective point of view. That's the only form that we're aware of it being instantiated in. Whether or not it could be realized in a sort of silicon, non-meat based kind of artificially constructed system is an open question, and we don't yet understand what's the neural basis of our own subjective awareness, anyways, right? So we're not in a position yet to begin to ask, okay, well, how different could an artificially constructed being be from a human brain-based person, and yet still have that sort of basic personhood attribute of subjectivity? Sorry, I threw a bit of I'm conscious of having thrown a bit of jargon your way, but that seems to me the central issue of personhood means you are a subject. You are not just an object doing things, right? But you're a subject looking out at the world with a certain kind of perspective on reality. And I don't think we know enough yet about the human brain, let alone about what's possible in artificially constructed systems, to know what is the minimal condition on achieving that physically, whether it be in a brain or some other kind of device.
Would that make God somehow a super subject, in that he would have some kind of over or uber awareness of things? And if so, does that mean God would not only have free will, but would be somehow beyond free will? God doesn't have to make choices, does he?
Well, if he's aware of all things, but if all things are not co-eternal with him, right? If you thought of everything God was aware of as being co-eternal with him, then right, the idea of God making choices would seem to fall out of the picture. It'd be hard to motivate, right? But if on a classic monotheistic view, God alone is fundamental reality, exists of necessity in himself, and all else springs from his creative activity. So yeah, God's aware of his creation, but he's aware of it in the very act of creating it and sustaining it, right? Also, on a classical theistic picture, God didn't boom, zap, big bang, right? Now he's done just to sit back and watch the show. God sustains the world in being moment to moment. If God didn't actively sustain physical reality, including you and I and our immediate environments, it would all just vanish, right? The world doesn't exist on its own steam on a classical theistic picture. The cosmos, that is, the created reality. So God is actively choosing to do that.
Yeah. I use these little icons that I put up for the show, and one of them that I found that was cute is a picture of the world and tumult going down there, and God and an angel on a cloud looking down, and the angel says, "See, I told you I was against free will." And I'm just wondering that if we look at the Adam and Eve story as the first free will story, why would God give human beings free will, presumably? It would seem to cause a lot of chaos, a lot of misery. Is it that God wanted to distance himself from the inevitable chaos and say, well, look, I didn't cause that genocide. That's on you.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to say anything glib about the problem of human and animal suffering, so-called problem of evil. Why would God permit the kind of horrendous forms of suffering and evil that we see in our world? I don't want to be glib about that at all. But you're kind of broaching that. That's a big topic. Philosophers and theologians have grappled with that topic for millennia.
Well, let's forget the problem
Right.
of evil.
Okay.
Let's just
Right.
talk about free will, the choice to go left or right, or to have apple or cherry pie.
Kind of make that disclaimer because I think it could be offensive to some people.
Yeah.
That
How does God benefit from letting me choose between cherry and apple pie?
Well, does it have to be for God's benefit, or can it be a gift? Right. So on classic Christian theology, Jewish theology, God gifts parts of His creation, human beings at least, maybe other beings that we don't know about, with this ability to make choices, to be, if you like, mini creators, right? Much in a kind of finite, created kind of way to kind of imitate God, right? If God is the being of surpassing value in reality, then beings that in some faint kind of way echo certain aspects of God, being aware, being knowledge, having a certain, but in a more limited way, having knowledge, having a certain ability to make choices and create and carry out purposes. That seems like a valuable part of creation. So if God desires to bring about a valuable creation, it seems like among the best forms of creation are going to be ones that involve beings like that, right? Imagine a vast, beautiful cosmos that would appeal to a theoretical physicist. It works by elegant principles, but it has no intelligent life whatsoever, right? I think that's an inferior kind of reality to a reality that somewhere along the way there are beings that begin to emerge that become aware of themselves as parts of this reality. I think human beings are extraordinarily valuable things. Animals in more limited ways, who have subjective awareness and have the dignity of making kinds of choices. I wouldn't say free will. You could talk about the question of free will when it comes to certain kinds of animals, but animals clearly do make choices, right, out in their natural environment. I think there's a kind of beauty, a nobility to animals, right, because they too are creatures that share in a lesser way in the ability to be aware of their environment, right, and to act in the world. So I would say for that. Now, it may also, the question of being of benefit to God, right? So classical theists say that God is supreme, complete in himself. Even if he hadn't created us, he wouldn't be deficient in any way. But still, it would be a good thing, and certainly good for us, for God to engage in interaction with creatures, right? So he's got to create creatures in order for them to be able to, for there to be that kind of creator-creature kind of relationship. That's a valuable aspect of reality as well.
So to us or to God?
Well, I'd say it's just intrinsically valuable. It's a valuable way for reality to be. It's a slightly dicey issue that I'm of the issue of
well, because in a capitalistic society, we often equate value with your value versus my perceived value. So that's why I'm asking whether it's God's valuation, our valuation, or some grander valuation that somehow is beyond even God and us.
Yeah. Well, I think all value is grounded in God in some way, but it's a kind of, it doesn't have to be a value for God. Mm-hmm. It can be just valuable in itself. It's intrinsically good. You look at a beautiful natural scene, right? I think that beautiful natural scene has intrinsic value, even if no one's there to appreciate it. It's potentially of value to some of us if someone, an explorer stumbles upon it, right? But it's already valuable in itself. There are forms of value. Beautiful mathematical equations are valuable. Yeah. So.
Well, I was going to just ask you about animals too, because we can look at the whales, we can look at elephants, we can look at the great apes, we can look at crows and parakeets, and they all seem to be on the cusp of an awareness. They may not, I mean, whales certainly have whale songs that have complexity, not the complexity of a Beethoven or a Mozart composition. Parrots or crows, famously the Aesop tale about dropping the pebbles into a bottle to get the water to rise. We've seen these creatures do that. Apes, famously Coco, and the hand signal. So these are creatures that if we accept that God has created, even if we accept that God has allowed evolution to go forth, they seem to be in this gray area between, say, what we call the automatonic gnat or fly or paramecium and humans. Are they? What purpose does it serve, for example, to be in that gray area? Do you think, if any?
What purpose does it serve?
Or what value? Just to go back to
Yeah,
what we just
well,
said.
I think that it's a kind of in some ways lesser value than to be a fully self-aware, mature human being. But it's valuable in its own right to be a kind of, there's a dignity to being a choosing kind of creature, right? That can display a certain degree of intelligence. And as you say, with some of the higher primates, as we better understand now, to display a kind of empathy, which is something that human beings didn't really recognize that animals were capable of, right? But is strongly suggested by recent careful study of animals in their native habitat. So I don't know. I think developmental processes are inherently beautiful sorts of things, right? That things emerge out of this. Isn't there something grand about the cosmos? Okay, just thinking about it as an impersonal developing thing, where over after this initial extraordinary burst of energy, this slow coalescing of gases and material, and the formation of stars and planets, and then suddenly, at least on planet Earth, life first beginning to get hold in extraordinarily simple form somehow, and then this continuous developmental process. There's extraordinary beauty to that, right? It's not static, right? The ancient Greeks famously tended to like to see the highest forms of beauty being kind of static, fully completed, right? And there can be a kind of beauty to a completed product, but there's also beauty to a developmental process as well. And so I think that's what we see. Have you ever seen the Terry Malick film Tree of Life?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's that extraordinary interlude of about 15 minutes where he's basically doing the creation story, right, from the Big Bang with this dramatic operatic singing, right? And I think that's just very powerful, right? It's a scene that is meant to display the beauty of the unfolding cosmos. And so I would say animals have a share in that, and so do we, right? On standard Christian theology, human beings, as we know ourselves to be, are far from what we're destined to be. So there's this, we were created immature, right? It's not just a story of the fall, right, embedded in the Adam and Eve story of human beings being alienated from God and needing to get back there. No, we need to get somewhere that right now we have no inkling of. We're going to become much more extraordinary beings post-mortem on standard Christian theology. So the developmental story continues for us as well. We're not as we are presently constituted. We're not the pinnacle of created reality.
Now you just used the term destined. Are you a determinist? It sounds like not, from what you said earlier, that you were using destined in a colloquial sense. Are you a compatibilist? And just for someone who doesn't know, could you just briefly define determinism and compatibilism and what you are?
Yeah, I'm not a determinist. A determinist is someone who thinks that the world basically works like a very well-tuned Swiss clock,
Yeah.
right? Boom, 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 completely predictable. Each step, each movement of the clock is utterly predictable from what went before. And then the determinist has this way of thinking of the cosmos as being like that. It's operating according to laws of physics, ultimately, that say, tell me what state the world is in at any moment, right? And then run that state, the variables, through these laws of motion, and boom, it spits out, here's what the world's going to be like 5 seconds from now. It's perfect, no possibility of surprise, right? I don't think the world is like that. I do think there are fundamental laws, though, that do powerfully govern how things unfold, but I think of these laws as being statistical. They yield a space of possibility. There's only so many possibilities. It's not possible for me to be on Mars 5 minutes from now.
Yeah.
That's not in the cards. Cannot happen, right? But it is possible for me to be in another room 5 minutes from now. I could decide to get up and walk out. So that's not yet determined, right? It's unlikely. I'm here in conversation with you. I don't have any particular reason to do that, but I might, right? So I'm not a determinist, and a compatibilist thinks if the world were determined, we'd still have free will. And for the compatibilist, the kind of core idea of free will is being able to do what you want to do, right? So if you want to do something, do your wants effectively get translated into actions, right? If you're the kind of thing that's able to go from this is what I want to do to this is what I do, then you're free. You did what you wanted to do, right? But the incompatibilist, that's me, says, yeah, but how did you get to be the kind of being that wanted to do those things, right? If that wasn't up to you, and if those wants in the circumstance guaranteed you were going to do this thing, well, then it looks like this behavior of yours isn't ultimately up to you either, right? Ultimately, it's due to those factors that brought you to this moment and that configured you with the particular beliefs and desires that you have that sort of inevitably led you to make the choice that you did. That's not free will. It was inevitable. It was already in the cards. So the incompatibilist says free will means what I do is not already in the cards. It's not fully guaranteed by anything that's already happened, right? The compatibilist says no, it's consistent with that. As long as what you do is not as a result of someone manipulating you from the outside somehow, forcing you to do, putting a gun to your head, then you're acting freely. So the compatibilist has a very minimal idea of free will. The incompatibilist says more is required than doing what you want to do. What's more that is required is that it not be inevitable that you chose as you did.
Now, you had mentioned earlier, talked about the concept of beauty, and as someone who's a writer and spent decades in the art, I often think that the idea of beauty is, art is beauty, art is truth, art is this, art is that, all art is political. It gets very sloganeering and very silly. Do you think that there's any relation between the concept of beauty and free will? Just throwing that out there.
That's an interesting question. And I'll be thinking about that after we're done talking, I think. I'll probably want to think about it some more. But I'll say beauty is a kind of value. Free will is potentially is the exercise of a certain kind of creativity and decision making, right? It's being confronted with options and choosing a certain path that you're going to pursue. And that can be, there's a kind of, there's certainly value there. And it's a kind of creative value. It's in the realm of aesthetic value almost, at least in part, right? There's also moral value, right? So it's not merely aesthetic. But I think there's an aesthetic aspect to the beauty of human beings having the capacity to make choices they do. So there's a kind of connection to be made there. But I feel like I just kind of made a first pass hand wavy stab at it.
So you are a Christian and you do believe in a God, I presume some version of the Christian God. Do you think then that free will is ultimately granted by this creator, this all-pervasive being, or not? I.e., do you think of free will arises through physical or natural means, or through metaphysical, supernatural means, or can it arise in either of those two ways in this cosmos, and that be kosher?
Yeah. I want to say yes. That is both. That is ultimately that I have free will, that anything is true in this cosmos is ultimately a result of God's choice, his actively bringing it about, right? The way in which God does that can involve natural processes. So human beings have evolved like all other forms of life, but God is over the process of evolution. Evolution was God's idea, right? His mechanism for this kind of unfolding, how to bring about this unfolding natural order, right, that ultimately would involve human beings and perhaps other rather special kinds of beings elsewhere that we don't even know about. So both. So it's not a supernatural act of God, if you mean by that God sort of doing something within the natural order of zap, saying, boom, here you go, you got this attribute, and there's no sort of natural processes, no causal antecedents to that that gave rise to that. No, it's a developmental process. I mean, right, Christians think about it this way. Christians think of themselves as being created by God, right? But no Christian that I know of, including creationists, deny that there's a developmental story to be told about human beings developing in their mother's womb, right? So you might say, well, which is it? Do you believe developmental biology, or do you believe that you were created by God? Right? And the standard Christian answer is, well, both. That's a means by which God brought about their coming to be a living human being, living outside its mother.
Let me start wrapping up with a couple of questions more specific to you and your own personal beliefs rather than as an overview of things. What do you personally think is the most overlooked aspect of the debate over free will? What would you like to see pursued that people currently are not pursuing in this debate?
I guess I'd circle back to something we touched on quite a while ago when you said getting away from binary thinking. I think because the sciences are picking up steam, the sciences that look directly at human nature, human behavior, the brain and how it functions, so that we're going to be hearing more from the sciences about what goes on when human beings make choices. Thus far, much of the public discussion is very poor by very smart people, but they're drawing very strong conclusions on the basis of very scant evidence. And they're doing so, I think, because, again, they're thinking free will is all or nothing, that it's not the kind of thing that can come in degrees. But it seems clear to me it's the kind of thing that can come in degrees, right? Because I can make choices, but if I've never contemplated a possibility, I can't choose it, right? So I have to be aware of it as a possibility. If I have no motivation, if there's nothing in my past experience that would motivate me to do something, I'm not really free to do that thing, am I, right? People don't inexplicably just start doing things, right? So my upbringing, the certain things about basic human nature constrain what I do. And sometimes I can be manipulated by unconscious factors. I think we're beginning to understand this a little better, even getting a handle on it in social psychology, how factors in our environment can influence us in ways we're not even aware of. Well, if that's true, and I think it probably is true to some degree, I think that can diminish our freedom in some cases, right? Because if I'm not aware of what's influencing me, right, I can't really choose, I can't sort of bring that motivation or that influence up for conscious reflection and ask myself, do I want to be the kind of person that gets strongly influenced by that kind of factor? So the question, we need to develop models. Classically, philosophers, when they've talked about free will, have talked about free will as just this ability to make choices that is sort of, that separates us from the natural world, right? And some of this is owing to the influence of Christian theologians who sometimes have thought very dualistically about human nature with respect to the natural world. we're set apart from it, right? We alone we're aware of ourselves, and we have this capacity to make choices. We now, in 2018, better understand just how deeply human nature is embedded in the natural world. It emerged through a natural process, so we're part of the natural world, right? And so we have to think about free will in a way that fully takes that fact on board and say it's a constrained free will. That's the key thing. There was a book called Action, 5 Questions, where a bunch of scientists and philosophers were invited to talk about the nature of human action. I have a short little piece in there. But I was struck by a number of these short little entries by kind of just little popular essays by scientists who, again, engaged in this kind of binary kind of perspective of thinking, well, now that we've shown that human beings aren't utterly free in some sense, whatever that would be, therefore they're not free at all, right? And we're understanding that the idea of free will is an illusion. And again, there's no reason to make that kind of choice.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this is a typically human thing. I've done a couple of shows talking about human sexuality, and people want to find a gay gene or a gay brain rather than thinking that it might be a multiplicity of factors and that people can get to that state of being by multiple means. But what do you think would happen if, say, in 25, 30 years, some X factor came that one way or the other showed conclusively that we had free will or didn't have free will? Do you think that X factor then ameliorates the debate, or do you think it sharpens it? And could there even possibly be an absolute point X that settles it?
Good. Yeah. Well, I sort of doubt that it's going to be a simple little X factor, just like you say, genetically, trying to understand all kinds of features of human personality and whatnot. What we're learning in this science of in genomics, right, trying to understand the genetic underpinnings of all kinds of things is it's really complicated. There's a whole bunch of variables that probably subtend any given interesting human feature. But that said, sure, can I imagine that neuroscience could get to the place where it could develop sophisticated models of what's going on in real time in the human, cortex, right? In an area of the brain where everything comes together when human beings are making decisions, and they can get to a point of being able to predict with high, probability, very high probability, what someone is going to choose to do. Not do you want to wiggle your finger left or right, but when you're making the most important choices where you're feeling conflicted, right? You don't know what you're going to decide, but they, just by monitoring brain activity, could, let's say 98% probability, predict what you're going to do. Would that shake my confidence in the idea of free will? Yes, it would. I'm not expecting that to happen. I'm not lying awake at night thinking it's going to happen. But yeah, in principle, there may be, very likely are, sheer computational limits to the abilities of neuroscience, even with advances in computing, to be able to monitor literally billions of neurons in a living human brain, and all the influences coming in, all the stimuli coming in, perceptually and otherwise, thoughts flitting through your head, to monitor all of that and to develop a model that synthesizes all that and predicts exactly how these things are going to flow together outward in a subsequent state, how they're going to co-evolve, is very likely beyond the reach of any science in the foreseeable and long distant future, I suspect.
Does the idea of qualia, that we can never quite know that what you determine is the color green is exactly what I determine the color green, although I guess we have rods and cones in the eyes and we could somehow maybe be able to see as you are seeing or something, but
We
Yeah,
assume
right.
that these correlate.
Yeah.
That if the same sort of thing's going on physiologically, then what's going on when I'm subjectively having a color experience must be the same as you because it has similar causes.
Right. So does the idea of qualia, do you think that puts up sort of a boundary that's insuperable in terms of getting to free will?
Well, I mean, I do think there are, when we talk about qualia, the qualities of the way we experience things. You know, the look of a red rose on a bright, sunny day to a normally sighted human being, right? The way that rose looks isn't out there on the rose,
Yeah.
right? Um, the way what physics describes what's going on the surface of the road is nothing like that. But
And
still,
an insect can look at the same flower and see vastly different patterns.
dogs have different color systems,
Yeah.
so presumably it has a different qualitative character to the way they experience color, and we don't know what that is.
Yeah.
We could just guess by analogy. How does that differ from the way human beings? We'll never know.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think qualia point to a kind of a built-in limit, especially once you go outside the range of human qualitative experience. For scientists studying, they can study physiologically a dog's brain, right? But they never can correlate it. At least the scientist who herself has color experience can know what it's like, you know, qualitatively, subjectively, for a human being having color experience, because she has it, right? But I only directly access my experience. You only directly access your experience. We can directly access brains together by doing, you know, as neuroscientists, develop models for how they work, but not the experience itself. So the experience is kind of outside that net of what can be directly kind of characterized in scientific terms. How does that relate to free will? Well, there is a subjective experience of acting, right? Most of us, if we're not subject to certain disorders of the will that some people are, but most of us think of ourselves as kind of in control of what we're doing. Even when we're not thinking about making choices, even when you're riding your bike, driving your car or whatever to get to work, you have this vague sense of being a person in control of what he's doing, right? That's a quality, a subjective quality. Some philosophers have wanted to say that's a kind of proof of free will. We experience it, but I'm not moved by that. To say, well, it's certainly not a proof, right? Because maybe it's an illusory experience, right? Like the scientists who suppose. Maybe it's just it's a faulty experience of freedom when you don't really have it. But I would say it gives us reason to believe that we are free. The fact that it seems to us to be that way. Why is it reasonable for me to believe that I'm in a room surrounded by books, looking at a computer screen with your image on it? Well, because that's the way it perceptually seems to me, visually, right? Ultimately, I have to trust my fundamental seemings. I can't get outside of my experience and show, oh yeah, here's my experience, here's the world. You know, there's a reliable connection, right? So my subjective experience as of freedom is another way the world seems to me. I seem to myself to be a free and responsible being. So I think absent reason to think otherwise, that's reason that gives me a justification for believing it. In other words, it's innocent until proven guilty. Not everything can be proven by independent means. You got to start somewhere.
Well, let me finally ask you what you in the future will be working on or writing about. And if something happened, for example, in your life 15 years from now, 10 years, 2 years from now, that somehow you became an agnostic or an atheist, would that fundamentally change your idea about free will?
Ooh, good question. All right. So first of all, I'll be writing a range of articles, but I've got some book projects that I want to write. I want to write a book on might be called Being Human, something like that. Something about sort of human beings considered in philosophical perspective, informed by our best sciences of the mind. So it's kind of about the nature of the human mind, and kind of in philosophical and scientific perspective. That's one thing. I want to write a textbook I've agreed for Oxford Press to write a textbook on philosophy of religion. So that's something I need to get going on. And I have another book that I'm wanting to write for more popular audience, kind of say college-educated but non-academic audience, on philosophy, science, and Christian belief. Kind of systematically how I think about a whole range of things. And it, in some ways, less about how I happen to think about these things, as about give some recommendations about how one ought to frame these questions and how one ought to go about trying to answer them. It's shaped by, I have views on this, and I think sometimes people frame the questions badly. And if you frame the questions badly, then you're probably not going to come up with the best results. So these are three big book projects that I have in mind. How long it's going to take me to finish them, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, so if I somehow, I became a Christian my freshman year of college, and I was drawn to philosophy as a major ever since. So for me, trying to figure out this strange frontier called Christianity and trying to think about the problems of philosophy have always gone in tandem. And so it would be a really disruptive event in my life, academically, for me, because then I'd begin to rethink the problems of philosophy outside of that Christian theological framework that I have. I don't think it would immediately change how I think about free will, but I'm sure over time it might begin to cause me to entertain some hypotheses that I don't credit as much as I do now. But it would be an unsettling event, and I would have to go through a big rethink of the way I think about the mind, the way I think about free will, and certainly the way I think about God.
So religion isn't necessarily a tentpole to your beliefs about free will, then?
I don't think. I mean, there's an interaction, I think, going both ways.
Okay.
I think it would be hard for me to be a Christian if I didn't think human beings had some measure of freedom and responsibility, because I think that's a fundamental commitment of Christianity. But could I, apart from Christian theology, think that? Sure. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for spending a little more than an hour speaking with me. I will link to your Indiana University webpage, and anyone interested in contacting or writing to or just finding out more about Timothy O'Connor can go there. So again, thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Dan.